Before we start, we would like to inform you that this episode was recorded on November 26, 2019. Hello and welcome to Tech Nights, a podcast where we have conversations with different people doing research or activism in relation to social movements, gender, sexualities and digital technologies. My name is Onur.
And my name is Nadia.
In this episode of our podcast, we are joined by Cathy Urquhart. She is a professor of digital business at Manchester Metropolitan Business School in the United Kingdom. And her expertise is on grounded theory, theory building, and qualitative research methods in information systems. Hi, Cathy, welcome. How are you doing?
Fine. I'm very happy to be here. I'm looking forward to being part of your very first podcast.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We are very happy to have you here.
Yeah, definitely. So earlier today, you were a guest speaker here at University of Gothenburg. And you were talking about an important missing point on theory developments for information systems, which were the theoretical mechanisms. Can you tell us, our listeners, a little bit of this?
Okay, I'll try not to reprise the whole seminar, but basically what I was talking about today was the idea that we can use something called theoretical mechanisms to help us build theory. And fundamentally, a mechanism can be a bit of true theory. It can be objects, entities, actions. And in fact, a mechanism can be a number of things. But what a mechanism does is it explains something. So that's what a mechanism is doing. Now, as a grounded theorist, I've always been interested in theories and how they're built. And I would see mechanisms as a way of enabling us to really understand not just the themes or constructs in our theory, but also how those themes relate to each other. And the idea really that mechanisms are a causal notion, i.e. there is always something happening. Now, for many years, as an interpretive researcher, I found the idea of causality quite problematic until I read Marcus and Rowe 2018, who talk about constitutive causality. And this is the idea that causality can be intertwined, it can be situated, and it's about meaning, and that's based on Wittgenstein's philosophy. And so for me now, I would say that I'm just interested in mechanisms per se, and I don't want to call them causal mechanisms, because in our discipline that people tend to associate that with critical realism. Mm-hmm. What I'm talking about here is the idea of mechanisms for everyone, just a way of us building better theories in the discipline of information systems. Mechanisms have been used in sociology, psychology. There are lots of kind of parallel conversations in other disciplines about mechanisms as well. And I just hope to popularise them in our discipline.
Actually, it was a great, a really, really good seminar. I enjoyed a lot. Thank you so much for coming here. Yeah. So we were wondering, how did you become a researcher? Well, how did that happen?
How did I become a researcher? Accidentally, as maybe for so many of us. I was actually working as a systems analyst and a programmer, and my husband at the time and I were having some issues, and so we went on a teaching course together. Okay. And we both qualified, but we also split up. But no, this is my first husband, not my current husband. It's a long time ago now. And through teaching, I came in contact with a number of academics, and one of them suggested that I do a master's. Familiar story. So as I was doing the master's, I became more and more interested in research, obviously, And that master's was later converted to a PhD when I went to the University of Tasmania in Australia. And it was there in 1995 that I discovered grounded theory, and it's been bringing joy and interest to my life ever since. And it's really fired my interest in how we build theories. So to me, it's incredibly important that we all know what a theory would look like if we fell over it in the dark, as I say. One problem that we have, I think, in information systems and possibly other disciplines as well, is the notion of theory is taken as just a theory. And yet, certainly there's been debates in information systems that reveal that we have no consensus on what a theory is at all. And I think it would help our contribution as a discipline immeasurably if we could actually be more conscious about our theory building and really think about our contribution. And I think we have a contribution to make.
I agree.
Yes, that's very interesting. And in your research, you are also giving value to the, I think, interdisciplinary approaches and how the different disciplines can be connected to each other. And in our project, we also have a similar, we have an approach, transdisciplinary approach, which is bringing together researchers from information systems and from cultural sciences and social sciences, where we aim to do a research on digital technologies and their impacts on social movements and activism, and especially when it comes to activism in feminist activism and LGBTQ activism for seeking social justice. And in terms of that, the impact of social media is there and important, and we live in an actually digital age now, as we all know. And my question here is, the emerging technologies must have certain impacts on society and individuals. And how do you see the relationship of the social and the digital as an information systems researcher?
Well, you've asked the million kroner question really here, because I actually see what you've just said, understanding the interrelationship between technology and society as the kind of key challenge for information systems. And I think that information systems as a discipline is uniquely placed to solve this, because what we're interested in is the juxtaposition of technology and the social. And what I am absolutely fascinated by, and I'm sure you are too, especially in social media, is how, if you like, the material properties of the technology then start to both enable and constrain the social. And I think particularly with social media, if you look, for instance, how the Facebook feed has been redesigned over many years to try and promote certain types of social interaction, or how many misunderstandings and mistakes occur because of the material property of the technology. Now, I'm not saying for one moment that sociologists do not have a lot, and political scientists do not have a lot to contribute, because I think when we're looking at these societal problems, then you do need this interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approach. But at the same time, what I think is what is unique about information systems is that we are studying that nexus. And I suppose what we've got now in the theories of socio-materiality is a sort of ontological foundation to start to understand that slightly more. Though, of course, as is typical in information systems, there's all sorts of arguments about what social materiality actually is. But not bringing the material to the fore exactly, but understanding that intertwining, I think, is a real challenge, and hopefully what the two of you can bring to the project that you're doing.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That would be
Yes, hopefully.
hopeful.
Yes, the Holy Grail.
Yes.
Hopefully we can do that.
And your opinion on what role do you think digital technologies, and let's say social media, play in claiming social justice? Because there were certain movements in different contexts where people utilized from social media a lot, but there can be also certain threats to these movements. Do you have any opinion on how social media like positively or negatively impact these movements? What are the threats over there?
Oh, I have so many opinions on this. Social media is wonderful, the way it allows people to link up and organise, the way it allows people to collectively link up with people in similar circumstances all over the world. It has in the past, notice I'm saying in the past, really levelled the playing field between people and governments. But the approach I take to this is really almost like a discourse approach. If you think about the fact that what social media allows ordinary people to do is influence the discourse. And if you think of, for instance, what happened, the killing of that poor young woman in Iran in 2009, I think her surname was Sultani, I can't remember her first name. Now, that all went all around the world. We had the Iranian Green Revolution, and yet nothing changed. And so you look at repressive regimes such, China is a good example, Iran would be another, where that discourse becomes very, very tightly controlled. And then we look at the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and we look about how people's own data is kind of being used against them to manipulate them. And so you see that, it's always, if you like, a struggle for control of the discourse. So it used to be that rich men could own newspapers. Now what they're doing to gain power is to to buy Facebook adverts. So on the news this morning, there was a Facebook advert that had been pulled in the UK when it was found to, although it was political, it was supposed to be against Facebook's policy. And the reason it was pulled is because it's now Facebook's policy to say who it is being funded by. But for a long time now, maybe several years, we could also lay Brexit at the door of social media if we so desired. There is some evidence that Russian troll farms have, manufactured a discourse. So then we move on to the dark side, if you like, and what ordinary people can do. But I'm an optimist, and I still think it's a tool for good. But I think, if you look at also what's happening in developing countries, maybe all of us should be thinking more carefully about our own data rights and not give them away the way we do. So I think it's a mixed picture, and it's going to be very interesting to see what will transpire. But then again, maybe just the sheer multiplicity of social media will mean that it can never be fully controlled. And this is what we would hope.
Yes, great. And I totally agree that because people who live under oppression in certain places, they used to be using physical spaces for their activism, but now in digital media they have this new space that they can utilize, they can use, and that's very arbitrary. And in many ways, it can be used against these people, as we have been seeing in different examples in Turkey, Russia, in other contexts, especially just after the social movements, how people were being interrogated just because their social media postings. And so the state power is still there and still a controlling mechanism. But I'm also wondering, do you have, because this is something lacking in social sciences, that we are having trouble to understand how the technologies work as people from having different approach on these subjects, and how do algorithms, for example, work in this case? How do they define user participation in social media? Do you think it is connected to this interrogation? Or do you see any connection between these?
I think it's important for me as an information systems person and an ex-programmer to put forward the point that when we build any kind of system, we're building it on concepts and ideas, and it reflects the values and the attitudes of the person that is designing it and the company that is designing it. So I think there is a real problem, say in developing countries in particular, where you have systems that are rolled out that actually have a completely different set of assumptions about how people are going to use it. Now, you do see often a lot of subversion, that people use, for instance, social media in ways we might not expect, and in creative and innovative ways. And I think the notion of affordances is quite a useful kind of analytical peg to think about how the potential of particular social media might be actualized, and that helps us to get to the grips of to get into how the materiality of the technology might be affecting what's going on. I also have a question for you, which is, do you think that given that Google and Facebook have so much citizens' data, they own an infrastructure that we all depend on every day, do you think they should be accountable, and if so, how?
I have opinions on that. I think we have talked before about this, and I told him exactly when we were discussing on the questions that we were going to make to you and all this. We get into this algorithm part, and I told him, well, it's not that the algorithm per se it's bad. It's not the technology per se it's bad. It's who's behind it, right?
Absolutely.
Like
it's who's written it and for what purpose.
Exactly. Like you were saying, like from your perspective of an ex-programmer, you put your values and your biases sometimes,
your assumptions about the user.
So all these other things come in place when you're going to program something, and this includes algorithms, and this includes the design of a particular technology. Me as an electronic engineer, when we were also designing something, we were also thinking and making assumptions on what's this in our mind, who's going to be the user, right? But then the user might be not necessarily female sometimes, right? Not a child. For example, I was telling him when this controls of the Xbox first came out, they were so huge, and no one that did not have these huge hands could use it. So the person that designed this was not thinking that maybe a woman or maybe a child would be using, or maybe a man with smaller hands would be using these controls. So this is a thing. It's not that the technology, I think it's wrong per se, or it's bad per se. It's like the evil. It's who's behind it. So in terms of what you were asking on having accountable for example, Google or this big companies, or this big the ones that held the data of us right now, I think it's also what's happening with the people that actually build these algorithms to do what, and what is the people doing with this data now, right? So
I think this is one of the biggest questions of our age, because what Facebook, Twitter, all predicated on the idea, if you've got better data about people, you can sell them more stuff. So it's all about building up a very targeted profile of individuals, and I think that has huge consequences for data privacy. And so in a way, it's quite interesting. You think about, Facebook has, Facebook, WhatsApp, they have done a lot of good in the world just by allowing people, they haven't allowed it, but people have taken control, if you like, the affordances and the ability, for instance, to organise in a group. There is perhaps a sort of darker interpretation, is that if people interact over technology, they're not less likely to band together on the streets, as it were. But certainly at the moment in the UK with Brexit, we're not seeing that. We're seeing how the activism online then bolsters, if you like, the physical activism.
Definitely. We're seeing also that in Latin America with everything that is happening. I'm not sure
Chile.
if you're...
Yeah,
Chile, not
yeah.
only in Chile, Ecuador as well, Bolivia. It happened also in Colombia. I mean, it had happened before where these digital spaces then become some sort of like calling for physical activism. So I think it started, maybe not started, but it was a visible one with Egypt. Remember, like a few years back.
Yes, the Arab Spring.
Yes, exactly. When this social media, Facebook, happened to be the place where they will be like, well, they're not allowing us to do this on street, then we're doing it here, and then we're calling people to just actually, show up in a physical space and actually take action in a political way. And it changed a lot of things there. And now, for example, in Chile and Ecuador and Bolivia and everything that's happening there, they're also trying to make these changes, and it's pushing the.
But what I would say is the more insidious threat is where different interests try and take control of that particular discourse online.
Exactly.
And certainly in the UK, it's happened in a very hidden way. So on Facebook, you've got groups we have had groups that claim to be grassroots groups. Yes. And then you find, in fact, they're not grassroots at all. They have been funded by someone close to the government for a particular purpose. And that's not declared anywhere.
Yes. And these digital spaces can also be having very positive impacts for certain groups who cannot increase their voices or who cannot be heard in many cases. If I need to give an example, you might remember Gezi protests took place in Turkey in 2013. And surprisingly, this movement had so many different groups because it was a protest against the government and against neoliberalism and increasing authoritarianism in the country. But LGBTQ community and activists were at the forefront of the movement thanks to the digital media. They set the main discourse, and these digital spaces provided these encounters with different groups of people and who were exposed to, for the first time, LGBTQ discourse. And they changed how the discourse of activism has been formulated in Turkey, including more queer and LGBTQ perspective in this. So in that sense, digital spaces can be also very creating these possibilities, which is not easily possible at the urban space, at the physical space.
There are some very interesting points in what you say, because we're also then talking about questions of identity.
Yes.
And I remember seeing a film just recently, actually. I watched it again, called Pride, which is about how gays and lesbians supported the miners.
Miners.
And so even in the early 80s, without social media, they understood, that there was a parallel between oppressed groups. And so I would argue, probably as you would, that social media would allow people to find that connection more. But at the same time, if we look at, say, Extinction Rebellion, which is a massive movement all over the world, it's being criticised because it's too white and too middle class. So, so some very sort of complex and interesting questions of identity. And one thing to think about from a political perspective, perhaps, is that politics has shifted from a politics of economics to a politics of identity. And again, one question that's sort of interesting to pose is how much, but the economics still matter. Yes. And people's economic rights, I think, still matter. And I think its question is to how to perhaps reckon, so the identity can be, the politics of identity are wonderful, empowering and helpful, but they can be also used by certain people to divide everybody and to other certain groups. Whereas in fact, many of us perhaps would be united by economic issues, for
Yes.
instance.
Yes. So politics of redistribution,
Yes,
especially,
absolutely.
can be very
Yes.
impactful in this
Yes.
kind of possibilities of political participation as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
Definitely, yeah. Coming back to another point that you were saying about transdisciplinary perspectives that we were talking about before. So you now are in your research are using transdisciplinary perspectives on theory development, or are you maybe thinking choose this? This
Nadia,
path,
I
or-
could talk so long about this. So allow me
Please.
to talk about this. Okay, so historically, information systems as a discipline, and possibly management to some extent, definitely accounting, they're newer disciplines, they're newer academic disciplines. So what newer academic disciplines tend to do is they're quite nervous, I think, about their ability to build theories themselves, so they will pull in some reference disciplines. Now, in information systems and in accounting and in software engineering and in management, there's been a lot of navel gazing over the past few years about the lack of native theories in those disciplines. And I suppose my perspective as a grounded theorist is the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to build a theory from the data. So one of the most important aspects of theory is the theory needs to be empirically based, right? And if you think about the way Newton did it, it was by observation, right? Now, the beauty of grounded theory is that it looks at what the data is telling you. It doesn't come in with a previous superimposed theory and try and force the theory on the data. So I think, regardless of whether you're a grounded theory or not, looking carefully at the data and working out what the data is telling you rather than going with a preconceived notion is quite helpful. Now, I am not saying that reference theories are unhelpful. I'm not saying that you might not want to use large formal theories from sociology. I've talked before about the sort of prevailing discourses. I think, looking at political discourses, there's lots of theories that you could use at a large formal level. But what I am saying is that we should be building theories from the ground up, from the empirics. And I'm also interested in information systems actually coming up with some native theories of its own. But I think in order to do that, there has to be much more collaboration between those of us that build theories and those of us that test them. And we need to think more systematically about how we might move a particular theory into another area. Now, grounded theory has very clear and extensive guidance on how to do that. And you can broaden the scope of a theory or densify it. But we don't have that mindset in journal publication. We have the mindset it has to be new. So, the number of new, you could come up with another new theory of political movements on social media. You could, with a particular reference to LGBTQ and gender. But in my mind, it would be actually very important for you to then look at what the reference disciplines are and look at what other people have done. Because I suppose another way of looking at it is, although I would like to see theory building efforts joined up in my discipline, if that's not going to happen, I can join up my theory building effort with other larger theories from outside the discipline.
That is true. Do you see any, you have mentioned that there are some nascent type of theories coming, but do you see maybe a trend coming from the IS information systems going to that.
I'm, as always, Nadia, I'm quite optimistic. One thing I did notice when doing all this research about mechanisms is, though mechanisms historically has come from the sort of critical realist camp, now more people are talking about mechanisms anyway. And I just think it's a very, very useful shorthand for people to start to think about what their theory is actually saying. It allows them to explain it. So in a way, mechanisms might be an acceptable way to say, well, this is what I'm looking at, this is the sort of theory that I'm building. So I think it's already giving people permission to say, you know, in a way, I suppose what I'm saying is, you know, grounded theory is a kind of minority pursuit in information systems, but mechanisms might be a slightly broader pursuit that gives people permission to say, oh, well, this is the mechanism, this is the framework that I'm putting forward. And I think that's quite useful. So in terms of specific nascent theories, I have been quite pleased to see various mechanisms come from social media, actually. And that's been interesting because some of those studies have both quantitative and qualitative data. And so they have a very kind of firm empirical underpinning.
That is actually, we were talking a little bit before coming to meet you. We were talking about, because I was telling him what you were saying in the seminar, and then we moved a little bit on this part that you were saying about how if you're a qualitative researcher, then you're one thing, and then if you're a quantitative researcher, then you're another thing, and there's this gap, and where, like you were saying, like social media might be mixing this too, right? But I also think that there might be other places. My personal itch is video games. It's fascinating because in video games you have so many different professions and areas that you mix, because it's like a video game, it's like an artistic technology.
Absolutely.
So it's because people from the art, they come and put like some very cool story or very cool character, and then there's these group of developers, like programmers, and they come and make it alive, right? And then you as a user can come and play, like be this character in this magnificent world, but it's still a digital world. So these different things, and there's not enough, I would say that there is not enough research on this mixed type of things.
I was going to say something similar. I was going to kind of go back to one of the things I said in the seminar, which is about theories of the problem and theories of the solution. So this idea that our theories should be addressing real world problems, and that also our research should use the tools that are appropriate to solve the research problem. So you don't say, oh, I'm a grounded theorist, because grounded theory may not always be appropriate, or it may be that a mixed approach is needed. Or you can say, well, I do variance models, so that's what I'm going to do. That doesn't always work. So it's about looking at the demands of the research problem. And certainly with the video games, you know, having observed my own children, I wonder, and this is maybe a theory of a problem or a theory of a solution, which is, you know, what happens to a whole generation that has been transplanted into this world, and is it, you know, what does that do to someone's brain structure when you're growing up? You know, is it any different from the previous generation watching movies all the time? I have no idea. But if you wanted to start to abstract, you could say that potentially this generation is a much more visual generation.
Yes.
Yeah? So what's that doing? And why has academia not really reflected those kind of efforts? Why is it in social media research, for instance, that we fail to analyse the images? We're still analysing the text.
Yes.
Whereas, because, you know, the visuals convey emotion, And we have a whole generation now that is far more visually perhaps stimulated than the previous generation.
Definitely. Do you think maybe it's because of many, these big theories are built on analyzing text, or like maybe oldish, that they are not so malleable, so they can fit the new type of paradigms that
I think that's
living
right.
now?
I think because you have now got these kind of affordances that are completely new, that what might happen is that your reference theory probably would hold most of the time for human behaviour, right? Because human behaviour has been studied for a long time, how people interact socially. But it might be that the affordances of the technology are putting a new twist on that. They're enabling a different type of behaviour. So it might be a case of extending those reference disciplines, perhaps. And I think you're entirely correct to say that this is why I think theory building is so important when you're talking about technology, because the other thing I would remind people is that there is nothing to stop you building a lower level, small framework, a small substantive theory, which then you can perhaps relate to these larger reference theories if you need to, when you probably will need to.
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
Well, unfortunately, we're
running out of
time. Yeah, we're running out of time, but this conversation has been so interesting.
It was amazing.
Yes, thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank
for
you for
everything.
making it so interesting. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, hopefully maybe in the future we can have another chat and another episode to talk about different things. But definitely.
That would be delightful.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to this episode. We hope you like it. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. You can follow us on Facebook to learn about our activities, other updates, and give us feedback.
TechNact was brought to you by the University of Gothenburg and the research cluster TechNact. If you want to learn more about our cluster, please listen to our launching episode. See you next time.
See you!